The whole history of the Trojan War, the horse, before the war began. Long before swords clashed under the walls of Troy, before the horse stood silent in the city's square, the seeds of war were already sown. Wars are rarely born in the moment men believe. They are prepared quietly in the hearts of gods, whispered into the ears of mortals, written into the folds of destiny long before the first arrow is loosed. And the Trojan War, the greatest war sung by poets, was no different. The story begins not with armies or kings, but with beauty, a beauty so radiant it seemed to tilt the balance of the world. Helen, daughter of Zeus and Leda, was said to be the most beautiful woman alive, her face luminous as dawn, her presence enough to set hearts aflame. Men across Greece dreamed of her, feared her, and longed to claim her hand. But beauty has always been a dangerous gift. It stirs envy, ignites rivalry, and draws the gaze of gods who see in it both plaything and weapon. Helen grew surrounded by whispers of her destiny. Kings and princes came to court her, each more powerful than the last. They brought treasures, promises, and armies, ready to be sworn. Menelaus of Sparta, brother to the mighty Agamemnon, was among them. He was chosen not only for his wealth and lineage, but because he had sworn, like all the others, to protect Helen's marriage, no matter who won her hand. This oath, simple in form, would one day bind Greece to war. But before Helen's marriage sealed her fate, another seed was planted, one far above mortal halls, in the feasting of gods. At the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, when immortals gathered in splendor, a single act of spite set the world aflame. Eris, goddess of strife, was not invited, for who would welcome discord to celebration? Yet she came nonetheless, carrying with her a golden apple inscribed with the words, "To the fairest." 3 goddesses claimed it: Hera, queen of the gods, proud and regal; Athena, goddess of wisdom and war; and Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. None would yield. And so they turned to a mortal shepherd prince, Paris of Troy, to decide. Paris was no ordinary shepherd. Though raised in quiet on Mount Ida, his birth had been shadowed by prophecy. His mother, Hecuba, dreamed before his birth that she gave life to a torch that set Troy aflame. Fearing the vision, Priam, king of Troy, ordered the child to be cast away. But fate does not surrender so easily. Paris was spared, raised in obscurity, yet always carrying the unseen weight of destiny. When the goddesses appeared before him, shimmering in their divine forms, they did not offer simple pleas. They offered bribes, for even gods know the weakness of men. Hera promised him dominion, power, and kingdoms without end. Athena offered wisdom, glory in battle, and the brilliance of strategy that would make him invincible. Aphrodite, smiling softly, promised him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris, young, untested, and human, chose love. He gave the apple to Aphrodite, sealing not only his fate, but the fate of nations. In that moment, the threads of destiny pulled tight. Helen, already married to Menelaus, was promised to him by the goddess of love herself. And the gods, once insulted, never forget. Hera and Athena swore vengeance against Troy. So the war did not begin with ships or spears. It began with an apple, with pride, with a choice made on a mountainside. It began with the vanity of goddesses and the weakness of men. Helen's life in Sparta seemed peaceful at first. Menelaus ruled, stern but not unkind. Their halls were filled with wealth, with the laughter of feasts, with the security of alliances. Yet even in her safety, Helen's heart was restless. Beauty, when worshipped by all, becomes a cage. It binds the one adorned by it to expectations impossible to escape. And when Paris came to Sparta, carrying the smile of Aphrodite upon his lips, her heart was moved by something she could not resist, or perhaps by something no mortal could resist, bound as she was by the will of a goddess. Some say she left willingly, choosing love over duty. Others say she was taken, stolen in the night, her cries lost to the sea winds. The truth lies somewhere between choice and compulsion, between desire and destiny. But whether Helen fled with Paris or was carried away, one truth remained: she was gone. When Menelaus discovered the betrayal, his rage was boundless. But more than rage, it was humiliation that cut deepest. Kings can endure loss, but they cannot endure mockery. He invoked the oath that all the suitors of Helen had sworn years before. One by one, kings and warriors across Greece answered, bound by their word and by their pride. Agamemnon, king of kings, took command. Odysseus of Ithaca, cunning and reluctant, was forced to join. Nestor, old and wise, brought his counsel. Ajax, towering and strong, came with fury. And Achilles, the son of Thetis, destined for glory and death, sailed with them, his name already carried by whispers of prophecy. 1,000 ships, it is said, were launched, their sails white as seabirds, their prows cutting through the waves like spears. The sea groaned under their weight, the horizon filled with war. Greece had bound itself to Helen's face, to Paris's choice, to Aphrodite's promise. And across the waters, Troy waited, its walls high and proud, its people unaware that their fate was already written. The city of Troy stood like a jewel of the east, its towers gleaming under the sun, its markets alive with trade, its warriors fierce and loyal. Priam ruled with wisdom, Hector fought with honor, Andromache wept for futures she already feared. They believed their walls were unbreakable, that no army could breach their gates. But walls cannot keep out destiny, and destiny had already chosen. Looking back, it seems almost cruel, how the war was prepared before the first arrow was loosed. A goddess uninvited, an apple tossed, a shepherd prince tempted, a queen's heart swayed, a husband's pride wounded, 1,000 kings bound by oath. All of it a chain leading to fire, to ruin, to the night when a wooden horse would stand silent and waiting in the square of Troy. The war had not yet begun, but already, in the whispers of gods and the choices of mortals, it was inevitable. And so, before the first spear was thrown, before Achilles and Hector met in rage, before the horse rolled to the gates, the war had already lived 1,000 lives in the hearts of those bound to it. The world shifted quietly, and none who touched the apple or Helen or the oath of suitors would ever escape the weight of what was coming. The abduction of Helen. The sea has always been a thief. It takes ships, it takes men, it takes secrets carried on its waves. And one evening, beneath the quiet skies of Sparta, the sea prepared to carry away something greater than gold or treasure. It prepared to carry Helen. Paris had arrived in Sparta not as a warrior, but as a guest. Hospitality was sacred in those days, guarded by Zeus himself, who punished those who broke its laws. Menelaus welcomed Paris, the Trojan prince, into his hall with food and wine, never suspecting that under his roof, destiny was sharpening its knife. Paris was handsome, his youth carrying the kind of charm that disarms before it strikes. His words were smooth, his smile patient, and behind his every gesture lingered the invisible hand of Aphrodite. Helen watched him with a heart that felt both restless and bound. For years, she had been adored, praised, trapped in the cage of her own beauty, but here was a man who looked at her not as a prize, but as if she were a secret, meant only for him. Whether it was divine compulsion or human desire, Helen's eyes lingered too long, and in lingering, she crossed the threshold of return. The poets will forever debate whether she left willingly or was stolen. Did she slip quietly into the night, choosing love over duty, or was she carried against her will, her tears swept away by the salt winds of the Aegean? The truth is hidden, lost among centuries of retellings, but what cannot be denied is that she was gone. When Menelaus left Sparta for a funeral, Paris saw his chance. Guided by Aphrodite, who cloaked their escape in silence, he led Helen to the waiting ship. Some say she carried jewels and treasures with her. Others say she carried nothing but her beauty and her fate. As the ship's oars cut into the waves, Sparta's shore grew smaller, and Helen, the queen of Greece, became the captive, or the companion, of Troy's prince. The sea whispered of betrayal as the ship cut through its dark waters. The stars above bore witness, silent and eternal, as though even they refused to interfere. Helen's heart beat with a rhythm she could not name. Was it fear, desire, or the cruel weaving of the Moirai, the fates, who spun lives with threads mortals could never cut? In Troy, the news of Paris's return spread quickly. Priam, the king, welcomed his son, though shadows passed across the faces of his council. Hector, Paris's brother, frowned deeply when he saw Helen. He was a man of duty, not of desire, and he knew well that beauty carried fire with it. He warned that no good would come from harboring her, that to keep Helen was to invite war. But love and pride are deaf to reason. Paris claimed her as his, and Aphrodite's promise was fulfilled. Meanwhile, in Sparta, Menelaus returned to find his bed empty, his halls echoing with betrayal. His rage was not only the rage of a husband, but of a king dishonored. To be mocked, to be robbed beneath the sanctity of his own roof was an insult no ruler could bear. He tore his garments, his voice echoing through the palace like thunder, and he swore vengeance not with words alone, but with the weight of oaths sworn long before. For when Helen's suitors had once competed for her hand, they had bound themselves with a sacred promise. Each had sworn that no matter who won, they would defend the chosen husband against any wrong done to him. It was a clever demand by Odysseus, who had foreseen the storm that Helen's beauty would bring. And now, years later, Menelaus called in that promise. Messengers rode across Greece, carrying his fury. Kings and warriors who once desired Helen felt the chains of their oath tighten around their throats. Some came eagerly, hungry for battle, for plunder, for glory. Others came reluctantly, bound by honor though their hearts longed for peace. But come they did. One by one, Greece answered the call. Agamemnon, brother of Menelaus, gathered the greatest fleet the world had ever seen. His ambition burned brighter than loyalty, for in this war he saw not only vengeance for his brother, but a chance to cement himself as the ruler of all Greece. Nestor, wise with age, came with counsel, though his voice often drowned beneath younger fury. Ajax the Greater came with strength like iron, towering above men, a warrior whose pride was as heavy as his shield. Ajax the Lesser, swift and reckless, followed too, his fire untempered. Diomedes, fierce and brave, readied his men, eager for the glory promised in battle. And then there was Odysseus. Cunning, clever, weary of war before it even began, he tried to escape his oath by feigning madness, ploughing his fields with salt instead of seed. But they tested him, placing his infant son before the plough, and Odysseus swerved, revealing his sanity. Bound by the same oath he himself had crafted, he joined, his mind already calculating the cost. Finally, there was Achilles, a boy in years, but not in destiny. Thetis, his mother, tried to keep him hidden, dressing him as a girl among maidens, for she knew that if he sailed to Troy, he would never return. But fate cannot be hidden. Odysseus himself unmasked Achilles, and soon the young warrior stood among the greatest of Greece, his armor gleaming, his heart already chasing immortality. So the abduction, or escape, of Helen did not steal only a queen. It summoned an army. It chained 1,000 kings to a single cause. It gave reason for pride to clothe itself in vengeance. Paris carried away a woman, but what followed him across the sea was the weight of nations. In Troy, Helen walked among towers and markets, her beauty dazzling even those who cursed her presence. Some Trojans welcomed her, believing the union, a bond of love, blessed by the gods. Others muttered that she was a curse, that her face would draw fire to their gates. And in the quiet of her chambers, Helen herself wondered, did she come to Troy by choice, her heart swayed by Paris's charm, Or was she nothing more than a pawn of Aphrodite, a gift of the gods used to topple men and cities alike? She touched the smooth stone of Troy's walls and felt them cold beneath her fingers. They seemed eternal, unbreakable. She could not yet know that one day those very stones would burn. And so, as Paris laid beside her, as Priam sat uneasy on his throne, as Hector frowned at omens, and as Menelaus sharpened his rage across the sea, the world shifted. A queen was gone, a husband betrayed, an oath invoked, and 1,000 ships waited at the shore. The abduction of Helen was more than the theft of a woman. It was the theft of peace. And from that theft, the longest war of its age would be born. The Trojans watched from their walls as the sea darkened with ships, their sails blotting out the horizon. Fear and awe mingled in their hearts. Priam, their king, stood tall but heavy with worry. Hector tightened his grip on his sword, already seeing the years of battle that would follow. And Paris, whose choice had brought this storm, stood beside Helen, her beauty both his shield and his curse. The Greeks built camp on the shore, their fires burning through the night, their laughter masking the fear that hid beneath. The sound of hammers rang as they built fortifications, a second city rising against the first. The sea had carried them here, but it would be the ground that drank their blood. Helen, from her tower, looked out upon the black forest of masts. Did she regret? Did she weep? Did she whisper to herself that no beauty was worth this flood of steel? Or did she resign, knowing the gods had already woven her thread into this tapestry of ruin? The launch of 1,000 ships was not just the beginning of war. It was the beginning of the end for Troy, though none yet could see the horse that would one day stand within its walls. The gods had moved their pieces, the mortals had played their roles, and the sea, which had once held them back, now carried them forward into legend. The horizon behind them was gone. The horizon ahead was fire, 9 years of siege. The first landing had been fire and blood, but what followed was not the swift conquest the Greeks had dreamed of. Troy did not fall in a year, nor in 2, but endured for 9 long years, its walls unbroken, its people unyielding. Wars are not only fought in battles, they are lived in the spaces between, in the long days of hunger, the endless waiting, the weariness that seeps into bones, until men no longer remember what peace once felt like. The Greek camp grew into a city of its own upon the shore. Wooden huts rose, trenches were dug, watchfires lit every night. The sea remained their lifeline, carrying supplies and reinforcements, but also reminding them of home, of wives and children who grew older without them. Time stretched, and what had begun as vengeance turned into a cycle of raids, skirmishes, and losses, measured not in victories, but in survival. The Trojans, safe behind their walls, looked down upon their enemy with a mixture of fear and defiance. Hector, their champion, rode through the gates often, leading sorties that struck hard and returned before the Greeks could muster their full strength. Priam, wise and sorrowful, held his people together with words of hope, though each year wore deeper lines into his face. Paris still walked beside Helen, his pride refusing to bend, though whispers grew louder in Troy's markets that his desire had cursed them all. And Helen herself lived in shadow, her beauty now seen not as a gift, but as the spark that had lit the pyre, consuming them. The Greeks fought among themselves as much as against the Trojans. Pride is a weapon as sharp as any spear. And after years of stalemate, tempers flared. Agamemnon, king of kings, wielded authority with iron, but his arrogance sowed discord. Menelaus burned with rage still, but time had cooled it into bitterness. Nestor counseled patience, reminding them that Troy was strong, that only unity would win. Yet unity is the hardest thing to hold when war stretches into years. Among all, Achilles stood apart. His prowess was unmatched. When he entered battle, the Trojans trembled. Songs spread even before the war was done, speaking of his speed, his fury, his invincibility. But his pride was also unmatched, and his anger simmered like fire beneath ash. Patroclus remained his anchor, but even friendship cannot always temper destiny. The years carved scars on all. Diomedes fought fiercely, earning renown as one of Greece's strongest. Ajax the Greater proved a bulwark in battle, his shield like a moving wall. Odysseus's cunning saved them more than once, his words and schemes keeping despair from turning into collapse. And yet, for all their strength, the walls of Troy still stood, unmoved, untouched. The war became a rhythm. Summers brought campaigns, winters brought uneasy truces. The Greeks raided Trojan allies, burning fields, stealing supplies, breaking smaller towns, but Troy itself remained untaken. The Trojans endured, supplied by allies from distant lands, Lycians, Phrygians, Thracians, all drawn into the web of war. 9 years. Children were born who knew only the sound of war outside the walls. Young men grew to warriors without knowing peace. The gods themselves tired of the stalemate, and their hands grew ever more visible upon the battlefield. Hera and Athena, still bitter at Paris's choice, guided Greek spears. Aphrodite shielded Paris, pulling him from death when Menelaus would have ended him. Apollo walked beside Hector, lending him strength, while Poseidon shook the sea in wrath when his temples were dishonored. Olympus was divided, and when gods take sides, men pay the price. The Greeks, though fierce, began to wither under the weight of time. Disease swept the camp more than once, carried by the stagnant air, by the rats that crept in at night. Food ran low, and quarrels turned to blades drawn in anger. Agamemnon's pride and Achilles' fury collided in sparks that would soon ignite greater tragedy. Yet still, in the quiet nights, men whispered of Helen. Some cursed her beauty, calling her the cause of their suffering. Others dreamed of her face, believing that winning her would bring immortality. In Troy, she walked the walls, gazing down upon the camp, her heart heavy with guilt and longing. Did she regret? Did she wish to return? Or had she resigned herself to being forever the flame at the center of ruin? No answer came, only silence, broken by the sea and the cries of war. 9 years of siege. 9 years of dust, of blood, of hunger. 9 years in which men forgot what peace meant, and the world itself seemed to turn upon this single city. And still the horse waited, though none yet could see it. The wrath of Achilles. 9 years of war had carved deep wounds into the Greek camp, not only on their bodies, but in their pride. The Trojans still stood behind their high walls, their spirit unbroken. Allies came to their side, fresh armies that gave them strength while the Greeks grew weary, their unity cracking under the weight of time. It was in this long stalemate that a quarrel between kings became more dangerous than any spear, the quarrel between Agamemnon and Achilles. It began not on the battlefield, but in the spoils of war. After one of many raids on Trojan allies, the Greeks divided their prizes, cattle, treasure, and captives. Among these was a woman, Chryseis, given to Agamemnon. But her father, a Trojan priest of Apollo, came to ransom her, offering gifts for her release. Agamemnon scorned him, mocked his gray hair, and sent him away humiliated. The insult reached Apollo, who does not forgive dishonor to his servants. The god stretched his bow across the sky, and for days arrows of plague rained upon the Greek camp. Men fell sick, soldiers died in heaps, and the fires of the pyres burned day and night. Desperation drove the leaders to demand Chryseis be returned. Agamemnon raged at the loss of his prize, feeling his honor torn away. In his anger, he turned his fury upon Achilles. Before the assembled army, Agamemnon declared that if he must give up his prize, he would take another, even from his own chiefs. His eyes fell upon Achilles, proud and blazing among them, and with venom, Agamemnon stripped him of his prize, the maiden Briseis. The insult cut deeper than any wound of spear or sword. To Achilles, it was not the loss of a woman, but the loss of honor. In the world of heroes, honor was life itself. Without it, glory faded, names were forgotten, and the reason to fight vanished. Achilles' fury shook the camp. He withdrew from battle, refusing to fight for Agamemnon, refusing to let his strength save men led by a king who had dishonored him. He sat in his tent, his hands clenched, his eyes burning with rage. Patroclus tried to calm him, but anger had filled his heart like fire fills dry grass. In the stillness of his tent, Achilles lifted his hands to the sky and called upon his mother Thetis, a sea goddess. He begged her to go to Zeus himself, king of the gods, and plead for the Trojans to gain the upper hand. "Let the Greeks suffer," he said. "Let them be driven back to their ships, so they might learn how much they need me." It was not mercy he asked for, but vengeance. Vengeance against his own people, against his own king. Thetis went, and Zeus, though reluctant, agreed. And so the tide of war shifted. Without Achilles, the Greeks faltered. The Trojans surged from their walls, led by Hector, their shining prince, their shield. Battle raged day after day, and for the first time, the Trojans pushed the Greeks back toward their ships. The camp shook with fear, for if the ships burned, there would be no escape, no return across the sea. Hector shone in those days, his spear cutting through the enemy, his courage lifting Trojan hearts. Paris fought beside him, though always weaker, saved more than once by Aphrodite's hand. Aeneas, the pious, fought bravely too, a man who would carry Troy's future when all else was ashes. The Greeks, though still strong, felt their hope waning without Achilles at their front. Inside his tent, Achilles heard the cries of battle, the clash of steel, the pleas of men. His heart beat fast, for the warrior in him longed to fight, but his pride chained him. He refused to rise, refused to forgive. His wrath was greater than his love for comrades, greater even than his thirst for glory. And so he sat, silent, while men died. Agamemnon too felt the cost of his arrogance. He dreamed dark dreams, saw his men falling like leaves in autumn, and he knew he had wronged the greatest warrior of Greece. Yet his pride was as heavy as Achilles's. He would not yield easily. Gifts were offered, words spoken, promises made, but Achilles turned away. No treasure could mend the wound carved into his honor. The war teetered on the edge of ruin for the Greeks. The Trojans pressed hard, their spears flashing like lightning in the sun, their voices echoing through the plain. For 9 years they had endured, but now they saw victory near. They pressed the Greeks to their ships, flames licking at the wooden hulls. Despair crept into every Greek heart. And still, Achilles did not move. His wrath was not a storm that passed, it was a fire that consumed slowly, leaving only ash. His name, once sung in hope, became a whisper in anger, a reminder of the pride that endangered them all. The wrath of Achilles had not yet reached its full measure. It would burn hotter still, and when it did, the plain of Troy would drown in blood. But for now, his silence was enough to tilt the balance, to let Hector and the Trojans taste triumph, to bring the Greeks to the brink of despair. And in the shadows of destiny, the wooden horse waited still, unseen, unborn, but inevitable. Yet even Hector was human. In the night, when the fires burned low and the cries of the wounded drifted through the streets, he walked the walls with heavy steps. He saw the faces of mothers clutching children, of elders too weak to fight, of priests offering prayers that seemed to vanish into the void. He carried all of them inside his chest, and their weight pressed heavier than any armor. The Greeks knew that as long as Hector lived, Troy would not fall. They spoke his name with dread, as a challenge, as a mountain they could not climb. Even Agamemnon admitted that Hector was the bravest of the Trojans. And yet, beyond the walls, fate wove silently. For no man, however noble, however brave, can fight against destiny forever. Still, in those years, Hector was the shield. His presence gave courage to allies who came from distant lands, who saw in him a leader worth dying for. Lycians, Thracians, and Phrygians stood by his side, drawn into the storm because Hector's spirit demanded loyalty. They did not fight for Paris, nor even for Priam. They fought because Hector's courage pulled them into belief. In the Greek camp, bitterness grew. They could not break Troy because they could not break Hector. His name became the measure of their failure. Even Ajax the Greater, massive and mighty, could not crush him. Diomedes fought bravely but faltered before Apollo's shield around him. Menelaus burned for revenge but never matched him. Only Achilles, silent in his wrath, remained the shadow looming above Hector's fate. One day, Hector stood upon the walls beside Helen. She asked him softly why he still fought, why he did not leave the burden to others. He looked out at the plain, at the Greek camp sprawling like a disease across the shore, and answered, "Because if I do not, they will come through the gates. And if they come through the gates, it is not only soldiers who die, it is children, it is mothers. It is the soul of Troy itself. I am the wall before the wall." Helen, whose beauty had summoned the storm, lowered her gaze. Even she, the cause and the curse, felt the weight of Hector's answer. The war dragged on, the years grinding down both sides, but always Hector stood, his spear raised, his shield unbroken. His courage was a song that lifted his people, a defiance that mocked the Greeks with every breath. But fate is patient, fate waits, and Hector's destiny was not to live forever as Troy's shield. His destiny was to meet Achilles, to face the fire with his steel, to fall, and with his fall, to begin the end of Troy. For now, though, he lived, and in his living Troy endured. The death of Patroclus and the rage of Achilles. The war had dragged into its 10th year, each season leaving the fields around Troy soaked in more blood than harvest. The Greeks pressed harder, but without Achilles they were crippled, and the Trojans, lifted by Hector, struck with new fury. The walls of Troy still stood unbroken, but the ships of the Greeks lay vulnerable on the shore. Their prows pointed uselessly toward a home they could not reach. Inside his tent, Achilles sat in silence, his pride still smoldering from Agamemnon's insult. He watched the battles from afar, heard the cries of his comrades as flames licked at their ships, and still he did not rise. His wrath was heavier than duty, his pride greater than pity. Yet even Achilles, son of Thetis, was not immune to love. Patroclus had been at his side since youth. They grew together, fought together, shared not only battles but their very souls. Where Achilles was fire, Patroclus was calm water, tempering his rage. Where Achilles sought glory, Patroclus sought compassion, tending to the wounded, caring for the weak. He loved Achilles, and Achilles loved him. Whether as brother, companion, or something more, the poets leave unclear, but their bond was stronger than any oath sworn by kings. When the Trojans, led by Hector, surged against the Greek ships and flames began to consume the wooden hulls, Patroclus could no longer endure the silence of his friend. He entered Achilles' tent, his face lit not with anger, but with desperate pleading. "Let me go," Patroclus said. "If you will not fight, then lend me your armor. Let me lead the men. Let them believe Achilles has returned. And their courage will rise. Perhaps the Trojans will fall back at the sight of your gleaming helm." Achilles' heart trembled. He had sworn not to fight until Agamemnon humbled himself, but to watch his people burn tore at even his pride. And Patroclus, gentle, steadfast Patroclus, stood before him, begging not for glory, but for salvation of their comrades. Achilles relented. "Take my armor," he said, "but do not press too far. Drive them from the ships, save the fleet, but do not pursue them to the walls of Troy. Leave glory for another day." Patroclus donned the armor of Achilles, the gleaming bronze that struck terror into hearts, the plumed helm that seemed to blaze in the sun. The Myrmidons, loyal to Achilles, rallied behind him, believing their master had returned to the field. With a cry that shook the plain, Patroclus led them forth. The Trojans reeled. They saw the shining armor and believed Achilles himself had entered the fray. Fear spread among them, their courage faltering, their lines breaking. Patroclus struck like lightning, cutting through warriors, driving them from the ships, pushing them back across the plain. The Greeks roared with new hope, pressing forward with him, but Patroclus, carried by victory, forgot Achilles' warning. His heart, filled with fire, burned with a desire not only to save, but to conquer. He chased the Trojans beyond the safety of the ships, drove them across the fields until the gates of Troy loomed before him. There, he met Hector. The two clashed beneath the walls, the fate of cities hanging on their spears. Hector, guided by Apollo, struck true. His spear pierced Patroclus, and the false Achilles fell. The Trojans roared in triumph, but Hector, standing over the fallen, saw his error too late. He had not slain Achilles, he had slain his heart. As Patroclus lay dying, his final words were a prophecy. "It is not you, Hector, who will stand victorious. Achilles will come, and when he does, you will meet your death." The news reached Achilles like a dagger. He tore his hair, fell to the ground, his cries echoing louder than battle. His pride shattered in an instant, replaced by grief so raw it seared even the gods. The man who had refused to fight for 9 long years now rose with a fury beyond measure. Thetis, his mother, came to him, her sea-born presence shimmering. She saw his anguish, felt the storm within him, and she knew his fate. If he returned to battle, he would die young, but his name would live forever. If he stayed, he would live long, but his name would fade into silence. Achilles did not hesitate. "Let me die tomorrow," he said, "if only Hector dies today." The gods themselves trembled at his rage. Hephaestus, the smith of Olympus, forged for him new armor, greater than any ever seen. His shield shone with the images of the world itself, the earth, the sea, the stars, the lives of men in peace and in war. His helm blazed, his spear gleamed, and when Achilles strode onto the plain once more, even the Trojans felt the shadow of death fall upon them. The wrath of Achilles, born in insult, now burned with grief, and in its fire destiny sharpened. The death of Patroclus was not only the loss of a friend, it was the key that unlocked Achilles' rage, the spark that would consume Hector, and through him the city he fought to protect, the fall of Hector. The plain before Troy had seen many battles, but none like the one that now prepared itself. The Trojans had tasted triumph when Hector struck down Patroclus, believing for a brief moment that Achilles himself had fallen. But when the truth spread, when the Greeks carried Patroclus's broken body back to their camp, and when the cry of Achilles rose louder than thunder, every Trojan heart trembled. Achilles' grief had turned to rage, and rage had turned to something greater, a hunger that no man could withstand. He had refused to fight for 9 years, but now, clothed in the armor forged by Hephaestus, he shone like a god of death. His new shield bore the whole of creation, the heavens, the seas, the labors of men in peace and in war. It was not merely a weapon, it was the world itself carried on his arm, and behind that shield Achilles advanced. When dawn broke, the Trojans saw him. His helm gleamed, the horsehair crest blazing like fire, his spear glinted sharp as lightning. His eyes burned with grief and fury, and even from the walls of Troy, they could feel the storm that followed him. Mothers clutched their children, elders bowed their heads, and even the warriors who had fought bravely for 9 years felt despair creep into their hearts. Achilles did not come quietly. He drove into the plain like a force of nature. The Trojans fell before him in heaps. No spear stopped him, no shield slowed him. He cut a path through men as though they were grass before the scythe. Aeneas himself, though destined for survival, fled before his fury, saved only because the gods plucked him from the field. Paris hid in the shadows, his bow trembling uselessly in his hands. The Trojans who once charged proudly now broke, scattering like leaves before a storm. Achilles sought one man and one man only, Hector. Hector, the shield of Troy, the beloved of his people, the son of Priam, the husband of Andromache. Hector, who had killed Patroclus, and with him awakened the wrath of Achilles. The gods watched, divided, some urging Hector to flee, others whispering courage into his heart. Apollo, who had guided Hector's spear, now withdrew, leaving him to his fate. Athena, cunning and merciless, stood beside Achilles, guiding his steps. Even Zeus weighed the scales of destiny and knew Hector's thread had reached its end. Hector stood upon the walls, his armor shining, his spear steady, but his heart heavy. He looked out upon the plain where Achilles raged, and he felt fear. Not the fear of death, for Hector had always been ready to die for Troy, but the fear of leaving his family behind. He thought of Andromache, who begged him not to go. He thought of little Astyanax, who once cried at the sight of his father, Helm, but now would soon cry for a father lost. He thought of his parents, Priam and Hecuba, who would mourn not only a son, but the hope of a city. For a moment, Hector faltered. As Achilles drew near, Hector's courage wavered, and he turned, fleeing around the walls. 3 times they circled Troy, Hector running, Achilles chasing, both swift as the wind, the Trojans watching from the ramparts in breathless silence. Hector, the defender of Troy, fled, and the hearts of his people cracked with sorrow. But destiny does not allow heroes to run forever. At last, Athena, disguised as Hector's brother Deiphobus, appeared before him and urged him to stand. Believing he was not alone, Hector turned to face Achilles. But when he called for his brother, no answer came. Athena had vanished, and Hector knew he had been deceived, yet he did not despair. He set his feet, lifted his spear, and faced the storm. The duel began. Hector's spear flew first, striking Achilles' shield with force that would have felled any other man. But the shield forged by gods held firm. Achilles hurled his spear, guided by Athena, and though Hector dodged, it returned to his hand, unbroken. They clashed in close combat, swords flashing, shields ringing, the plain echoing with the sound of gods and men watching. Then came the fatal moment. Hector aimed at Achilles' chest, but his armor was impenetrable. Achilles knew where to strike. He drove his spear into Hector's neck, where the armor did not guard. The blade cut deep, and Hector staggered, falling to the earth. As life ebbed from him, Hector spoke, his voice steady though weak. "Do not leave my body to the dogs, Achilles. Give me to my family, let me be buried with honor." But Achilles, blinded by rage, spat his answer. "No, I would that I could carve you limb from limb and devour you raw for what you have done to Patroclus. The dogs and birds will feast on you, Hector, while your city weeps." Yet even as he mocked, fate recorded another truth. For Hector, with his last breath, spoke prophecy. "You may kill me, Achilles, but your end is near. You will not live to see Troy fall." With that, Hector died. The shield of Troy, the man who had carried the city upon his shoulders, lay broken in the dust. And Achilles, unrelenting, pierced his ankles, tied him to his chariot, and dragged his body across the plain. The Trojans cried out from their walls, Priam tearing his hair, Andromache collapsing with grief. Helen weeping for the man who had shown her kindness when others cursed her. The sight seared itself into every heart. The hero of Troy, dishonored in death. Yet even in rage, Achilles could not erase what Hector had been. For as long as Troy stood, as long as songs were sung, Hector would remain its brightest flame. His fall marked not only the beginning of the city's doom, but also the measure of its greatness. And in the silence after his death, as the dust settled and Achilles dragged his body toward the ships, the gods themselves mourned. For though they had chosen sides, they too recognized the nobility of Hector, the man who had fought not for glory, but for love. The fall of Hector was more than the death of a warrior. It was the breaking of a city's heart, and though Troy still stood, its fate was sealed. The death of Achilles, the death of Hector did not end the war. It only deepened its shadows, for though the Trojans wept, though their champion lay lifeless, Troy's walls still stood, and as long as those walls endured, hope flickered within them. Yet Hector's prophecy hung in the air like smoke. Achilles, in slaying him, had stepped closer to his own doom. Achilles returned to the Greek camp in triumph, but his triumph was hollow. Patroclus was still dead, and even as Hector's body was dragged through the dust, the emptiness in Achilles' heart remained. Rage had carried him, vengeance had driven him, but grief was not so easily conquered. For days he refused to eat, refused to rest, refused even to cleanse himself of the blood that caked his skin. Achilles, struck by the sight of the old man's grief, thought of his own father Peleus, far away in Greece, waiting for a son who would never return. His heart softened. He wept with Priam, and at last he returned Hector's body for proper burial. For a brief moment, war yielded to shared sorrow, and even Achilles, the most furious of men, remembered that grief is the common language of mortals. But fate does not pause for long. The war dragged on. The Trojans, though wounded, still fought. The Greeks, though bolstered by Hector's fall, still could not breach the city. And always, destiny pressed closer to Achilles. It was Paris, of all men, who became the hand of fate. Paris, whose choice of Aphrodite had set the war in motion, whose arrow had been guided so many times by divine hands, was no match for Achilles in strength or courage. But fate does not always choose the strongest arm. It chooses the thread already woven. The day came when Achilles, still burning with vengeance, stormed the plain once more. He drove the Trojans back to their walls, his fury unending, his spear unstoppable. The Trojans fled before him, and Paris, weak among warriors, took his place upon the wall, bow in hand. Beside him stood Apollo, god of the bow, who had long shielded Hector and now sought vengeance for his fallen champion. Paris drew his bow, but it was Apollo who guided the arrow. The shaft flew swift and true, striking Achilles not upon his gleaming armor, not upon his shield. Granting him near invulnerability, but she had held him by the heel. That one place remained mortal, and through it, fate entered. Achilles fell. The plain shook not with the roar of his chariot, but with the grief of his men. The Myrmidons rushed to him. Ajax the Greater shielded his body. Odysseus called for order. Not upon the face of Agamemnon, whom he despised, but perhaps upon the memory of Patroclus, waiting for him in the silent halls of death. The Greeks mourned as they had never mourned before. Women tore their hair, men wept openly, And even Agamemnon bowed his head in grief, for he knew that without Achilles their hope dimmed. Thetis rose from the sea with her sisters, her cries echoing across the shore, and she mourned her son who had chosen glory over life, who had traded years for immortality and song. The funeral of Achilles was like no other. A great pyre was built, flames rising high into the night, carrying his spirit skyward. His ashes were mingled with those of Patroclus, for even in death they would not be separated. The Greeks slaughtered horses and captives in his honor, their blood feeding the flames, their cries rising into the heavens. Games were held, races, contests of strength, feats of arms, so that Achilles would be remembered not only in grief but in glory. Yet even in death, Achilles divided the Greeks. His armor, the shining gift of Hephaestus, was too great a prize to leave unclaimed. Ajax the Greater and Odysseus both sought it, each believing himself worthy. When the council awarded it to Odysseus, Ajax's heart broke with shame. He fell into madness, slaughtered cattle believing them to be enemies, and when his mind cleared, he fell upon his own sword. Thus Achilles, even in death, brought ruin among his own, but it was his absence that weighed heaviest. Without Achilles, the Greeks felt hollow. Their greatest flame had been extinguished, their greatest weapon lost. And though the war still raged, though new heroes would rise, none could match the son of Thetis. Yet Hector's prophecy was fulfilled. Achilles had slain him, but in so doing had sealed his own fate. And in the silence after his death, as the sea lapped against the shore and the smoke of his pyre drifted into the sky, the shadow of the wooden horse grew closer, for the death of Achilles marked not the end, but the final turn of the tide. Troy still stood, but the gods and destiny had already chosen its ruin. The trick of the horse. The war had lasted for 10 long years. Achilles was gone, Hector was gone. Ajax too had fallen to his own despair, and still Troy stood. Its walls, built by gods, remained unbroken. Its gates had never been forced. The Greeks had hurled themselves against stone, year after year, and had won only corpses and sorrow. Many whispered that the war could never be won, that it would be better to sail home and leave Troy to the will of the gods. But among the Greeks, there was one who never surrendered to despair, not because his body was the strongest, but because his mind was sharp as a blade. Odysseus, king of Ithaca, the cunning one, the man of many turns. Where others saw walls too high to climb, Odysseus saw weakness not in stone but in hearts. He understood that Troy would never fall to force. Only deceit, clever and cruel, could breach what spears could not. And so he conceived the trick that would become legend. The Greeks pretended at last to abandon the war. They burned their tents, packed their ships and sailed away, leaving behind only the empty shore and silence where once their camp had roared. But they did not all leave. Hidden beyond the horizon, their fleet waited. On the beach, they left a gift, a massive wooden horse towering as high as Troy's gates, its belly hollow, its form majestic. To the Trojans, it seemed a marvel, a monument, a thing too strange to ignore. Within it, concealed in darkness, hid the finest of the Greeks. Odysseus himself, Menelaus burning with vengeance, Diomedes, Neoptolemus the son of Achilles, and others who still had the strength to finish what 10 years had failed to achieve. They crouched in silence, their breaths shallow, their swords ready, waiting for night. When the Trojans emerged from their city and saw the empty shore, their cries of joy shook the air. The enemy was gone. After 10 years, they believed the war had ended. They wandered among the ruins of the Greek camp. They laughed, they sang, and when they saw the horse, they marveled. Was it an offering to Athena, goddess of wisdom and war? Was it a gift left behind to appease the gods? Some argued to destroy it, to burn it, to drag it to the sea and let it sink. Cassandra, daughter of Priam, cursed with prophecy no one would believe, cried out that it was a trap, that ruin waited within. She tore her hair, she screamed to her people, but her words fell like stones into the sea. for Apollo had cursed her long before. She would always speak the truth, and no one would ever listen. Laocoon, a Trojan priest, hurled his spear into the horse's side. The wood shook, and from within came a muffled clang of hidden armor. But fate intervened. As Laocoon cried out that the horse must be destroyed, great serpents rose from the sea, sent by the gods, and devoured him and his sons before the horrified eyes of Troy. To the Trojans, this was no omen of danger, but of divine wrath against those who doubted the gift. They believed Athena herself demanded the horse be brought into their city. So with ropes and wheels, singing as they hauled, the Trojans dragged the towering horse through their gates. Children danced around it, women scattered flowers before it, men drank and feasted in celebration. The war was over, they believed. Troy had endured. But within the wooden belly, the Greeks crouched in silence. They heard the shouts of joy, the wheels grinding against stone, the gates creaking open, the cheers echoing through the streets. They felt the horse lurch as it passed through the Scaean gate and came to rest in the heart of the city. Then night fell, and the Trojans, drunk with victory, sank into sleep. The trick had worked. The horse stood in Troy's square, massive, silent, waiting. The city that had defied 1,000 ships now carried its own destruction inside its walls. Odysseus, crouched in darkness, closed his eyes and whispered to himself that deceit, not strength, had won the day. He thought of the long years of slaughter, of friends lost, of the blood that had watered the fields, and he knew the end was near. Yet even he did not know how great the ruin would be when night gave way to dawn. For the horse was more than wood and rope. It was destiny carved in timber, fate disguised as a gift, the end of Troy waiting in silence. And as the Trojans slept, their laughter fading into snores, their torches dimming to ash, the gods looked down. Some wept, some smiled, but none interfered. The game was over. The horse had been taken in. Troy had sealed its fate with its own hands. The night of fire. Night fell over Troy with a softness that deceived even the wary. For the first time in 10 years, the city slept without fear of spears at its gates. Wine flowed, laughter echoed, and the people dreamed of peace. Fires burned low, children curled beside their mothers, warriors rested their heads without armor close at hand. The great horse loomed silent in the square, its wooden flanks gleaming faintly in the moonlight. Inside the horse, the Greeks crouched in silence. Sweat trickled down their faces, muscles cramped from hours of stillness. They listened to the faint murmur of the city around them, a song fading, a door closing, footsteps stumbling into silence. Odysseus's eyes shone in the dark. He placed a hand upon the wood, waiting for the signal. At last, the sound came. The hush of a city deep in slumber. Odysseus gave the nod. Quiet as shadows, the Greeks descended through the hollow belly of the horse. They opened the hatch, dropped to the earth, and scattered across the square. Their breaths were sharp, their blades gleamed faintly, and their hearts beat with the knowledge that this night would change the world. They moved to the gates first. Sentinels slept, their spears leaning idly beside them. With swift hands, the Greeks cut them down before alarms could sound. The gates creaked open, and from the shore, a signal fire was lit. Out on the Black Sea, the Greek fleet, which had hidden beyond the horizon, surged back, oars cutting through the waves, sails snapping like wings of death. Within the walls, chaos began. The Greeks set torches to houses, to temples, to towers. Flames licked into the sky, crackling, roaring, consuming the wood and stone of a city that had stood for centuries. The Trojans awoke to fire and screams, their dreams of peace shattered in an instant. Men stumbled from their beds, grasping swords too late. Women cried out as their homes filled with smoke. Priests fled their temples as statues toppled. The streets became rivers of panic. Hector was gone. The shield of Troy lay long in the grave, and none could replace him. Priam, aged and frail, clung to the altar of Zeus in his palace, his eyes hollow with disbelief. Andromache gathered her child, Astyanax, clutching him to her chest, though she knew in her heart what fate awaited him. Paris, weak and shameful, had already loosed the arrow that killed Achilles. His part was done. Now he too would vanish into the ruin. Odysseus, Diomedes, Menelaus, Neoptolemus, they struck like wolves among lambs. Menelaus sought Helen through the smoke, his heart burning with rage and longing. Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, carved through Trojan blood as if to avenge his father. Odysseus, cold and focused, led men to seize key gates and towers. Diomedes slaughtered in silence, his spear drinking deeply. The temple of Athena, once the city's guardian, was violated. Cassandra clung to its statue, crying her prophecies that had gone unheard, and even now no one listened. Dragged away, her voice became just another scream in the storm. In Priam's palace, Neoptolemus stormed through the halls. Priam, king of Troy, clutched the altar, begging the gods for mercy. But mercy had fled this night. With brutal force, Neoptolemus struck him down upon the very stones where he prayed, his blood mingling with the ashes of his house. Andromache's cries pierced the night as soldiers tore Astyanax from her arms. The boy, innocent and trembling, was hurled from the walls, dashed upon the stones below. His small body was the final sacrifice demanded of Troy. Andromache collapsed, her grief greater than any flame. The city roared with fire. The wooden horse stood silhouetted against the inferno, a monument to deceit. The Trojans fought bravely in scattered pockets, but without unity, without Hector, without hope, they were slaughtered. Streets ran red, statues fell, temples burned. And Helen walked through the chaos untouched, her beauty still untarnished. Menelaus found her at last, her face lit by the flames that consumed her city. For a moment, sword raised, he thought to strike her down, the cause of 10 years of slaughter. But when her eyes met his, when her voice trembled with sorrow, his rage melted. He lowered his blade. Whether by love or by the god's will, he could not kill her. He led her back to the ships, her beauty surviving where armies had perished. By dawn, Troy was no more. Its walls, once thought eternal, lay blackened and broken. Its people lay slain or bound in chains. Its king was dead, its women enslaved, its children murdered. A city that had stood proud for generations was reduced to ashes in a single night. The horse stood still in the square, blackened by soot, silent witness to the ruin it had delivered. It would stand forever in memory, not as a gift to gods, but as a warning to men. Beware gifts from enemies, beware pride, beware deceit. And the Greeks, though victorious, felt no joy. They had destroyed Troy, but in doing so had destroyed something within themselves. For the fire of Troy would never leave their dreams, and many of them would never see home again. The night of fire was the end of Troy, but it was also the end of innocence. No wall, no city, no man could ever again believe that strength alone could protect against the cunning of men and the cruelty of gods. The weight of memory. The flames of Troy did not fade quickly. They burned through the night, through the dawn, and through the hearts of those who watched the city collapse into smoke and ash. For the Greeks, victory had come, but it was a victory painted in blood. For the Trojans, defeat was not only the fall of walls and towers, but the loss of everything that had once defined their world. And for the gods, who watched from Olympus, the war was another reminder of how fragile mortals were, and how easily pride and beauty could topple kingdoms. The survivors of Troy were few. Women were led away in chains, their eyes hollow, their voices silent. Andromache, widow of Hector, carried no child now. For little Astyanax had been hurled from the walls, sacrificed to fear. Cassandra, cursed with truth no one believed, was dragged toward ships, her screams lost among the roar of the sea. Hecuba, aged queen, was bent with grief, her husband Priam slain, her city gone. Helen, the woman at the heart of it all, returned to the arms of Menelaus, her fate spared by beauty that even rage could not overcome. The Greeks, though triumphant, did not carry home joy. Their ships were heavy with treasure and captives, but also with omen's darkest storm clouds. Some would never return. Ajax the Lesser, who violated Cassandra in Athena's temple, was doomed to perish at sea beneath the goddess's wrath. Agamemnon, who led them, would find death at home, slain by his own wife Clytemnestra in revenge for Iphigenia. Odysseus, clever architect of the horse, would wander for years, cursed by Poseidon, before ever seeing Ithaca again. The victory at Troy was not the end of suffering, but the beginning of it. And so the memory of the war spread, not as a story of triumph alone, but as a warning. Songs were sung of Achilles' wrath, of Hector's nobility, of Priam's sorrow, of Helen's beauty, of Odysseus's cunning. But beneath them all ran a darker truth, that war devours all, victor and vanquished alike. The horse itself became more than wood and rope, it became symbol. To the Greeks, it was the genius that broke Troy. To others, it was treachery, deceit carved into timber. Through generations, men spoke of it not only as a weapon, but as a lesson. Beware gifts from enemies, beware the pride that blinds judgment, beware the trick hidden inside triumph. For what had Troy been before the war? A city of trade, of song, of towers that gleamed in the sun. Its markets overflowed, its palaces shone, its warriors defended honor with strength. And what was it after? Ash, bones, a story told by poets. The people who once walked its streets were scattered like leaves, carried into slavery, exile, or silence. The gods had written their fate upon the stars, but it was men who carried it out with their own hands. The Greeks, too, were changed. They had set sail with hope of glory, with songs of quick victory, but they returned scarred, haunted, broken. Some did not return at all, for 1,000 ships launched, but not 1,000 ships returned. And Helen, what of her? To some, she was the cause of it all, the spark that lit the fire. To others, she was the victim, a pawn of gods and men alike. She walked again in Sparta's halls, but whispers followed her forever. Was she guilty, or was she only the mirror in which men saw their own desires and destroyed themselves for them? Her face may have launched 1,000 ships, but her silence afterward spoke louder still. As for Hector and Achilles, their names lived longer than their flesh. Achilles chose glory over life, and he won it, for men remember him still. Yet he died young, his ashes mingled with Patroclus, his heart forever unfinished. Hector chose duty over self, and though he fell, his name carries honor even in defeat. Perhaps history belongs not only to the victors, but also to those who die nobly. The weight of memory is heavy. It presses down on every city that rises, reminding them that walls, however strong, cannot protect against pride, against betrayal, against the will of gods or the cunning of men. Troy's story is not only Troy's, it is every city's, every nation's. For every people believes their walls will stand forever, and every people forgets that fire waits at the gate. And yet, even in ruin, Troy did not vanish completely. From its ashes rose stories that would travel farther than any ship. Aeneas, survivor led by the hand of destiny, carried his father on his back and his son in his arms, fleeing the flames. Guided by the gods, he would journey to distant lands, and from his blood Rome would one day be born. Thus, even in destruction, Troy's shadow stretched across centuries, its memory giving birth to new empires. So the war ended, not with peace, but with silence. The silence of ashes cooling, of bodies left unburied, of songs rising from poets who turned tragedy into immortality. The Greeks sailed away, the Trojans scattered, the gods withdrew. But the horse remained, carved not in wood now, but in the minds of all who heard the tale. And we remember. We remember because Troy is not only a city that fell long ago. Troy is every place that trusts too much, that forgets the warnings, that welcomes the gift that carries ruin within. The horse waits still, in every age, in every heart, in every deception men accept with blind pride. The whole history of the Trojan War is not only the story of warriors and kings, of gods and beauty, of pride and vengeance. It is the story of how easily a city, no matter how strong, can be undone. And it is the story of how memory itself can outlast fire. Carrying the voices of Hector, of Achilles, of Helen, of Priam, of Odysseus, of every soul who walked through that long night. The horse stood silent once in Troy. It stands still in memory. And as long as men build walls and trust them, as long as they accept gifts without suspicion, as long as pride blinds judgment, the story will remain. Troy burned, but its ashes still speak.